Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Lincoln Mitchell, a professor of political science at Columbia University, where he also serves as an associate scholar in the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies. He's the author of numerous books on the former Soviet states, baseball, and democracy, the latest of which is The Giants and Their City, Major League Baseball in San Francisco, 1976 to 1992. Welcome to Background Briefing, Lincoln Mitchell.
Thank you for having me back on.
Well, thanks for joining us again, Lincoln. And I wanted to talk to you about Russia's FSB's activities. Obviously, Russia's at war, and they've deployed the FSB in the military. And we hear a lot about how poorly the military are doing, but we're not we don't quite know the full scope of the FSB activities. I know that, for example, they have roaming assassination squads that they send throughout Ukraine that are doing horrendous stuff. But they're also very active in Moldova, and they're also active in Georgia, where there's just been some massive demonstrations against what looked like a kind of a Russian-type operation on the part of the government to censor the press and also basically make the foreign press sign as foreign agents. Very, very similar to the kind of legislation that Putin has introduced in Russia. So let's start with Georgia. What's going on in Georgia?
Well, this is, I think, a reasonably complicated situation. The current Georgian government, which has won a series of elections going back to 2012, in that would have generally be considered free and fair elections, where they ousted a kind of neoconservative authoritarian government or semi-authoritarian government, has over the last years been, since the very beginning, been criticized by their opponents for being pro-Russia. At the same time, has pursued a pro-European and pro-Western policy towards NATO and towards the European Union. However, and this is a big however, in recent years, that's begun to change. And particularly with the Ukraine war, where Georgia was not enthusiastically supporting, to put it nicely, the sanctions that the United States and our European allies put on Russia, partially because this government simply, I don't think, has this kind of visceral support for Ukraine that a lot of countries do. And I can explain why in a second. And also because Georgia was invaded by Russia in 2008. And when that happened, the world did nothing. So when I was last in Georgia, which was about 10 months ago, people told me, very high-ranking people said, look, our view was that if things go poorly in Ukraine, Putin might want a quick win and invade us again. And other people said if things go well in Ukraine for Putin, he may get confident and invade us again. So that fear of that Russian invasion was very real. But since that war, we've seen this government move substantively away from, since they came into power, this government has done very little to move democracy forward. And this particular law, which you described, it goes a little further than that, because it's not just media. So it's not just someone who works for, a foreign media operation. It's one domestic Georgian media that gets 20% or more of its funding from outside sources, which might be USAID or European assistance, as well as non-governmental organizations that might be acting as watchdog organizations, watching the government, or in some cases delivering services. Now, because you spoke about the FSB, we should note that Russian money is going into Georgia all the time to support pro-Russia groups, pro-Russia organizations. But the Russian money, that's not coming in the form of grants where there are applications and where it's recorded and where it's, made public. American and European money is mostly in Georgia through those kind of grants, which are already made public. The Georgia Young Lawyers Association, just to pick one example, they receive foreign funding. It's on their website. They're not trying to conceal anything. But the fear is if they have to register as foreign agents, they will face repression from the government and they will be identified always as foreign agents, which will undermine the work that they do. And Georgia is effectively a one-party system. So the NGO sector is really the only check on the government.
So what about the economic ties? You've got all those Russians that fled. A lot of them went into Georgia, fled the draft and fled the war. And on the other hand, there's an enormous amount of trade going on, continuing, right, that's how Russia's getting around sanctions, aren't they? They're using the stands in Georgia and other countries and Armenia, they're all working with the Russians to avoid the Western sanctions.
I don't think it's quite that simple in the case of Georgia. Georgia has been kind of half in on the sanctions and half out. I mean, the prime minister of Georgia, who is, I would describe as not politically deft enough to handle this situation, did say very early on that these sanctions hurt us a lot more than they hurt Russia, right? In other words, if Georgia participates, it really damages the Georgian economy, which is very reliant on trade with Russia. So there is that side of it. They have kind of half participated in the sanctions, but not fully, and certainly not enthusiastically. But this isn't a Central Asian country or Iran or something, which is just, trying to work. Or on the other hand, there are countries like India that remain massive markets, or China, of course, for Russia. So that kind of is a little complicated. Now the issue with these Russians coming in, I mean, if you read Masha Gessen in the New Yorker, you think they're all there to read Pushkin and Tolstoy. But a lot of these people are there to avoid the draft, and a lot of them are there just because they want to go somewhere and spend their money. I mean, when I was in Georgia, first of all, there's graffiti. I mean, I remember distinctly seeing in English, so meant for foreign eyes, no Russians are welcome, whether good or bad. So not the greatest syntax, but you got the point. There's a lot of resentment because a lot of these, I heard stories of Russians coming in and talking about how great their troops were doing in Ukraine. So there's a lot of tension between these Russians coming in and the Georgians who, for good historic reasons, are not comfortable with a lot of Russians coming to their country for whatever reason.
So let's then turn to Moldova. There is a sizable pro-Russian population there, and Zelensky warned some time back that there were Russian provocateurs coming in, or pro-Russian provocateurs coming in to stir up trouble, and somehow the enclave of Russians in Transnistria that borders between Moldova and Ukraine, it's a sort of sliver there on the east, has Russian troops. Now, there's even a possibility that the Ukrainians may invade. The Russians are saying that's going to happen. But what's happening there, do you think? That seems to be a possibility of a new front.
Yes. And, the Russian military in Ukraine, I mean, I think we have to hold two ideas in our head at the same time. Let's start with this. They are being humiliated, right? They did not expect to be in this war the way they are. They did not expect to take the casualties. They did not expect Ukraine to be able to fight back as effectively as it has. On the other hand, Russia could still win. And I think Putin's strategy here is to fight not just in a lot of places, but in a lot of dimensions. Now, I talked to a lot of people in Georgia and in the Georgian government. I met with the president this week, who is not part of the government there in that way. And no one's really sure. There's a lot of accusations, but no one's really sure the depths of the connections between the Georgian government and Russia. But even that perception helps Putin, right? The perception that he's gaining ground in Georgia, that he's gaining ground in Moldova, all of that helps Russia and hurts Ukraine. And that's always been the way Putin has done this. It's always been a multi-layered war, not just, it's been a lot of, guns and soldiers, but also cyber, also the politics. And Putin is continuing to do this. Is this war going to open up a front in Belarus? I mean, in Moldova? I don't know. But, the Russian FSB, the Russian Foreign Ministry, the Russian media now is saying that because of this unrest in Georgia, the Georgian government is going to plan an offensive attack on Abkhazia, which is a de jure part of Georgia that's de facto under Russian control. And they're doing that just to stir up problems in Georgia and the region. So they're going to keep fighting on a lot of different levels, and it's going to be tougher and tougher for Ukraine.
In terms of, though, moving on the other front in the north with Belarus, it's obviously Lukashenko, the dictator there, is playing quite an interesting dance that he's had with Putin. It seems like the compromise he's worked out is that he will ramp up production of ammunition and other stuff for the Russian war machine. But Lukashenko did meet with Xi Jinping in China, and I'm wondering what that was about. Well, we know that the 10-point so-called peace plan that China offered up, nobody took that seriously. So is it possible that Belarus could be a cutout for Chinese support for Russia's war in Ukraine?
Well, Lukashenko meets with Xi Jinping because Russia, since this war started, is increasingly a Chinese client state. And Belarus is a Russian client state to a great extent. So why not meet with, the boss who's really in charge here? Belarus is, thousands of miles further to the west than Georgia. It is in that regard much more in the center of Europe. And a Putinist outpost in the center of Europe is very valuable. It's also very valuable to China. So Lukashenko has some real negotiating position when he goes to China.
So why does Putin need him if he's just a sort of appendage or a puppet?
Well, Putin needs whatever he can get right now, right?
Does he want to take it over altogether, in other words?
I don't think Putin wants to do in Belarus what he's done in Ukraine, right? This is not the reasons that he invaded Ukraine simply don't apply in Belarus. What he wants from Belarus is ultimately, will you send troops? Will you send munitions? Will you support us? Will you continue to trade with us? And the answer there is likely going to be, at least to the latter part, yes, and to the first questions, maybe.
Well, that's what he's been dangling all along. But my understanding is he doesn't want to get militarily involved in Ukraine because he doesn't trust his own military. And most of it is the Praetorian Guard, isn't it? They don't have much of a military.
No, but they can. But the soldiers at this point in this conflict, Putin is not exactly sending, crack, highly trained soldiers to Ukraine, right? These are conscripts who, it's in some sense, it's heartbreaking, right? These are conscripts who have been brought in, they're poorly trained, poorly equipped, and they've become cannon fodder while committing atrocities in Ukraine, tragically. And Belarus can certainly give those kinds of people to the war effort. That would be valuable to Putin.
So is it likely to happen then, do you think? In other words, you've got trouble in Georgia, you've got destabilization going on in Moldova, and you've got this tension between Putin and Lukashenko over how much he can squeeze him into committing troops. And the one thing that Lukashenko said is if there's one Ukrainian soldier crosses into the border, then the war begins. Well, that's a situation ripe for a false flag operation, isn't it?
For sure. And if Lukashenko wants this war with Ukraine, he'll have it, right? If there's plenty of ways to make that happen. But again, if you're him, you want to talk to China. What are they going to do for you, right? What do they want here? China, Putin in his effort to keep whatever threat Ukraine represented at bay has really lost a lot of influence to China. And so I think the extent, there's two people that can end this war tomorrow. One is Putin, and the other is Xi Jinping. And there's two people who can either expand this war or not expand this war. One is Putin and the other is Xi Jinping.
So is that to say then that to take a cynical view as opposed to a hopeful or even Pollyanna-ish view that somehow China is going to be the honest broker here to end this war, which I don't think is a possibility, although China does have to consider the brand China in terms of its exports and its European markets. But you're suggesting that the relationship is much deeper, and I would agree with you there. So is China then therefore happy to have the US and NATO bogged down in a European war, thinking that that might take the pressure off Americans' activities in the Pacific?
I might phrase that just a little differently. There has been a fair amount of coverage or analysis of this war that says this is a proxy war between the United States and Russia. And my view is that this is increasingly a proxy war between the United States and China. And the question is, how much more will China get pulled into this war? How much more do they want to get pulled into this war? What kind of weapons will they send to Russia, right? How much support will they continue to provide to Russia? How much trade will they continue to have with Russia? That's what I see as the key questions as we move into the second year of this conflict.
But that's going to change things enormously, particularly in an election year, because you've already got the pro-Putin caucus operating with the Freedom Caucus in the House, and more McCarthy and the Republicans are now talking about not giving Ukraine a blank check. So that's building on the American side, and it seems that that's a significant problem here for Biden. But if you start sanctioning China because of its overt support to Russia's war effort, and the Europeans might well follow, then you'll have supply chain problems in this country. Walmart shelves will suddenly become empty. The Republicans will be absolutely salivating over the idea that the economy is going to take a big hit, and it's going to help them get reelected. And they don't seem to care about Ukraine. They just care about power. So go ahead.
The scenario you've laid out is how this might play out, and but China understands that, and the Biden administration understand that, right? The United States sanctioning China is massively, as you suggested, a massively qualitatively different thing than sanctioning Russia. And as difficult as it was to get such strong European support for these sanctions on Russia, which really is, I think, an extraordinary diplomatic accomplishment by the president, and I have many criticisms of him, but you got to give Joe Biden credit for this. Bring that kind of a coalition together to sanction China will be much, much more difficult. So if, while the U.S. is warning China, don't arm Russia, don't arm Russia, the leverage here is very different because the sanctions would be devastating for both sides. I mean, I like to say that the U.S.-China relationship is, to pick a word from 2008, it's too big to fail, that bilateral relationship. And that's why this hawkishness on China is, in my view, very dangerous. And I should add, not least because, Mike Pompeo, the former Secretary of State, who is essentially running for president, I think will be running soon, on a campaign of let's go to war with China. And a war with China in the U.S. should be unthinkable. And both sides are dancing up to that in ways that can be very frightening right now.
Yeah, but you just said, Lincoln, just in closing, that essentially the war in Ukraine is a proxy war with China.
That's right. And to go back in history, during the Cold War, we had proxy wars with the Soviet Union, kind of all over the globe. And we managed to, it's a terrible thing to say, but they didn't lead to, millions of people died, right? Look at Vietnam, for example. But they didn't lead to all-out war between the two superpowers. And avoiding that has to be the top priority. But the China hawks in Washington are growing in power, and the U.S. hawks in Beijing have largely, hugely influential in the CCP. So this could get much worse.
Well, Lincoln Mitchell, I thank you for joining us. I appreciate it. And even though the news is rather bad, I appreciate getting a perspective on the various fronts that we talked about: Georgia, Moldova, Belarus, and Ukraine and China.
Thank you. And I know you don't bring me on your show for my optimism.
Well, let's hope there's some reason to be optimistic. And again, I've been speaking with Lincoln Mitchell, a professor of political science at Columbia University, where he also serves as an associate scholar in the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies. He's the author of numerous books on the former Soviet states, baseball, and democracy, the latest of which is The Giants and Their City, Major League Baseball in San Francisco, 1976 to 1992. This has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producer Graham Fitzgibbon. And to help us sustain this program into the future and assure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate or publictruthmedia.org, where you will find our non-profit Public Truth Media Foundation, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And if you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we'll include extended interviews searchable by topic and have made it easy for you to sign up for daily email updates that provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we also encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter and Facebook at Ian Masters Media. And please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And I'll be back again tomorrow with another background briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.
The guy that lived next door in 305 took the kids to the park and disappeared by 9:30. Who'll ever know how much he loved them so? That dark night alone in America. A quiet voice singing something to me. An angel song about the home of the brave in this land here of the free. One time, one night in America. one more light goes out in America.